why I kept referencing NAMI. There's the Psychologists Association, the Social Work Association, Nurses Association. They lay out a number of these things. Now, the bureaucracy often comes up with infographics, which are translations of complex academic material into easily appreciated material, like CDC often does infographics. I know SAMHSA is doing infographics, and they'll list epidemiologic data, they will list some of the research data, and then they will list options for what you can do. But, you know, in the end, it is up to us in terms of being educated about an issue, to understand the full spectrum of issues that go into that larger issue, which is why I mentioned bipolar. It's a good example. Nutrition, but it's not just nutrition. We have an obesity epidemic, so nutrition works. Exercise, well, your primary care is telling us the same thing. We've got integrated care. So those messages are not just coming from a behavioral health point of view. Your community safety is an issue because there's a cascade of consequences. If my kids can't get outside, they can't exercise. If they're dodging bullets or dodging bullies, then they are going to want to play video games from sun up to sundown. I mean, these are things that we derive from the common experience. And you don't have to do it alone, which is why these meetings are also useful, is that if you don't have to be a one-man band. I mean, it's okay to start off that way, but part of the 535 is that they respond to coalitions, they respond to multiple voices. You're not just a single opinion. If you're one person by yourself, if you can't sell to other people on the importance of your message, then you need to rethink how you're doing your messaging. There you go. The 535 responds to coalitions. I'm trying to get reelected. You know, Cantor had the money without the votes. It was the votes that would have kept him in office. I'm sure he's doing very well on K Street someplace, but that's not the point. The point is he lost his position. So I'm fond of saying that if you have a new idea, a brilliant idea, you're either a visionary or a fool. It's important to take risk. The visionary takes risks, and if it turns out they're wrong, they're just wrong. But if you don't take the risk to get the information, to carry the message to other people, to convince people of your vision, then you'll never know. One last.
Hi, I'm Perform, as I said earlier, from non-DC, but what I wanted to ask you is if you could share with the audience the importance of understanding trauma definitely has an impact on our community, but the stigma of not going to get treated that exacerbates the issues. If you could explain how devastating stigma is in our community in terms of mental health.
I'm sure my colleagues on the panel are going to address that also, but I think you've already summarized it. In case you didn't hear the young lady, people are afraid to ask for help because they're afraid of being called crazy, and they don't ask for help, and so what happens is we allow conditions to get worse. What we're trying to do is intervene early. If, in common parlance, somebody is not acting right, maybe they need your help. And we don't just step back and watch that person slowly sink into chaos. If we do that, then we do them a disservice, and we do our community a disservice, because when people act out, they usually act out within the context of the community. So you help them now when there aren't very many problems, or try to figure out what to do with them later when there's a whole lot of problems. So trying to change the social norm is an important part of communities of color. It is okay to ask for help. It is understandable. And in fact, we have these family reunions in my family. I've been a psychiatrist for over 30 years. 2 years ago, they finally asked me, would you give us a presentation on mental health?
You have arrived.
And that's the point. So she's right, and that's also something we can do. That's not a legislative issue, but it is an important community issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. As always, you do not fail to bring us the necessary information. So The next speaker, whose slides I'm about to load for us, is an old friend, and he's older than me, so I can call him old, that I've known for many, many years now. He's recently relocated from the D.C. area to Austin, Texas, where he now chairs the department and is an associate dean at the Houston-Tillotson University, Associate Dean for Health Disparities at the Dell Medical School there in Austin, Texas. Former chair of the Department of Psychiatry at one of our historically black colleges and university medical schools, Howard University. Physician extraordinaire, psychiatrist, psychologist, man of the world, Renaissance man, and now recipient of life membership in the Black Psychiatrists of America.
Man, I got fixed income. This will work out good.
He's also a past president of the organization and the current editor of the newsletter. And I want to highlight that before I let you talk and load up your slides, because I want everyone here today to understand two things about the Black Psychiatrists of America. They usually put me out front because they know I'll say stuff that others won't say. We have a newsletter which is always looking for perspectives on mental health, on issues of relevance to the black community. So if there's someone in the audience who has an idea of something, this is the editor of our newsletter. And he will be happy to talk to you, to tell you where to send a submission. I think NAMI and how NAMI and black people work or don't work well together, given your experience wherever you live. Some of us have had not so good experiences. Some of us have had tremendously positive experiences. The audience, I suspect, and we didn't do this for the first time. Give me a show of hands. How many people in the audience are psychiatrists? And of the people who are psychiatrists, how many of you are members of the Black Psychiatrists of America? See how slick I was? Because if your hand is not still up and you're a psychiatrist, well, I'm getting there, Dr. Newton. I'm working my way down. I'm working my way down. And then psychologists. Okay, fair number of psychologists.
Student psychologists?
Yes.
Students, yes. Social workers. Hello. In the house, social workers, nurses, nurse practitioners, advanced practice nurses, RNs, MSNs. And, y'all are just too far ahead of the curve for me. I'm not moving fast enough for once, huh? Okay, other healthcare providers. Pediatrician,
Yes.
Thank you for being here. Nutritionists, thank you for being here.
Caregivers?
Neuroscientists, teachers, consumers, educators, advocates, educators, community activists, advocates, people who just like to understand what's going on in the world as it relates to black people. Everybody raise your hand, because you're here today. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Lawson. I'm going to load your slides, and then you can begin your presentation. You find them, and we'll be done. Oops. Okay. You find them. You're in E. NAMI. We're going to give a nod to NAMI. See, we love our partners in the community. Dr. William Lawson.
Yeah. Thank you. And I just wanted to note, happen to be a member of several organizations. Of course, the Black Psychiatrists of America, encourage youth. I just discovered something called blogs. So if you're sitting around figuring out where can you write and you don't feel like you're going to write a lot, put it in a blog. If it gets a little longer, send it to our newsletter. And also, I'm the editor of the Journal of the National Medical Association. We want a real long piece in a referee journal, and we just got the increase in terms of our impact factor. I think 100 out of 200 journals, send it to us. Also, you say, well, I'm a member of the Black Psychiatrists, Association of Black Psychologists, as well as the National Medical Association. You say, well, I don't want to spend all this money for these organizations. Think what Dr. Clark just said. If you want to go out and make an impact, support the organizations that are going to support the causes that are meaningful for you. Now, let me just see if I got this thing down right, because this is not my, push the little button here. Yes, it goes. This whole question about a mentally ill, more violent, and just wanted to note, as you see, recently we have African Americans that died because of encounters with police. What in the world does this have to do with discussions of mentally ill? Well, I already heard one commentator say those people are crazy. Now I heard someone else say that those are lunatics, and there is no evidence, by the way, that the moon causes mental disorders. But the important point is that this is heavily linked to this issue, both in terms of shared stigma, because of the fact that a lot of these folks are suffering, can't get the help they need, because of the whole question about, is this involved with the perpetrators? And they're already talking about doing a better job screening police. And also in terms of explaining the victims, because again, and I'll say more about this later, a lot of the folks that were killed were in fact folks who had mentally ill diagnoses. How does mental illness appear in the news? One point that's emphasized in the news and the media, I think those of you who are movie watchers already recognize Psycho. Those of you who saw The Cell know about that. And I think if you go back and say the perpetrator of that had a rare form of schizophrenia, I think. And of course, the movie shooter. You want to get in the news? Just go in and shoot some people and proclaim yourself mentally ill, and then you'll be all over the place. Unfortunately, that has become the face of mental illness in recent years. So I just want to note the whole concept of psychosis. Basically, it's those people who have experiences that have taken out of touch with reality, who have beliefs, who have difficulty with thoughts, and who have hallucinations. Now, in terms of what has had to relate to mental illness, mental disorders are not only often recognized, but also there's, and I just want to emphasize this over and over again, because people have said, well, mental disorders aren't related to violence. Well, untreated, drug-using folks who have mental disorders, like everybody else, are likely to become violent. And not only that, I've heard people say, well, you know, we got to take guns and everything else from folks who are mentally ill. Well, bipolar disorder, dissociative disorder, depression, all these have been related to violent acts. So that means that somebody has a grief reaction or lost a loved one, shouldn't get a gun. The whole question becomes, what is a mental disorder, and when does it associate with violence? And the bottom line again, lack of treatment, substance abuse. Not just emphasize that point when I'm interrupted by the congressman, you at least take that home with you. Now, no, and I also want to emphasize this, and because we had an experience with this at Howard, and that is that also we always think of mothers as caring, loving, and so forth. Postpartum psychosis is a risk factor for the child. Folks can't accept it, they have difficulty, and that's when we have some very horrendous situations, because you can't believe that the loving mother, during that period of time, will develop beliefs that the child is a demon, that you need to kill the child, that you need to do other things to it. So just a take-home point for the community. Now, public surveys show that 60% of Americans thought that people with schizophrenia react violently towards someone else, while only 32% thought that major depression were doing so. I think the good news is the recognition that depression can be associated with violence. The bad news, of course, is that schizophrenia is thought to be especially associated with violence. But it's not that simple. I mean, the data is pretty clear. That is, if you take out substance abuse, if you take out lack of treatment, then the rates start falling down to the normal quotes, normal population. So more arrests than the general population when not under treatment. Mentally ill folks get arrested a lot. And I just want to emphasize, these are not for violence either. The guy who's disorganized because he didn't take his medication and doesn't go in to get his probation checked is going to be arrested. I had a patient who was just walking around cool, saw a little baby lying in a crib, picked the baby up. The mother freaked out, and he was quickly arrested. Good old substance abuse of various kinds. Now you say, well, wait a minute, we talked about opiates, and Dr. Clark did next job talking about opiates. The opiates don't cause people to be violent. Oh yeah? Tell that to the gangbangers in Chicago. That it becomes an important economic issue as gangs fight over turf. So the data is interesting and misleading. 10% of homicides are committed by individuals with schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, other psychotic disorders. A lot of people didn't believe it, but they checked back the data and found that was true. But when you look closely at the data, when you again took out the substance abuse, when you took out whether or not people were treated or not, rates fell to the same as it was in the general population. 30% of all family homicides was reported to have a serious psychiatric disorder, an abuse of alcohol or drugs, failure to take back medication. Again, a factor. And just the point again and again is we look at violence, folks have said, well, let's do something about violence in the community and let's do something about recognizing keeping guns away from mentally ill people. If you really want to make an intervention, if you really want to make a change in the community, you need to take away the drugs and you need to get folks into treatment. So how strong is the link? And this is just an article that's, they went back and checked again, the number of violent acts found the same point. And I just want to emphasize it again. That is, when you go back, you find that on the face of it, more arrests, more violence, folks who have a mental disorder. But then when you look at it more closely, look at the role of substance abuse, look at the role of who's not getting treatment, and the rates are pretty much the same general population. Again, so what is the problem? Simple. Lack of access. 20% of hospitals, and I just want to emphasize this point, my colleague Dr. Fuller-Torrey emphasized this point, that 20% of hospital beds for the mentally ill have dropped down substantially. Now, I'm not a big supporter of just expanding hospital beds, but I look at it as another parallel. Not too long ago, when I was in training, it was thought that if you reduce hospital beds, it was good. But what we thought was that if you take away the beds, the money that would go for the beds would go for the treatment and be more efficient. Well, that didn't happen. And folks ended up homeless, folks ended up in jail and so forth. So the turn of going, the trends, where we're at a point now where clearly there are insufficient beds for people who need treatment, and at the same time there are almost an absence of programs in the community for folks who require treatment. And so the result is that the homeless, those that end up in the criminal justice system are deprived of treatment. And as a result, they end up needing hospitalization, but it isn't there. So again, most of them now are occupied by people who have crimes. Get my glasses out, because Wesley, when you get past 70, you need them glasses, man.
That saves the trouble of reaching for them, yep.
So the point is that the absence of beds, I like this analogy, that in many ways these hospital beds can be looked at as ICU beds. That is, that they're the beds that are needed in the time of crisis when folks are severely ill. We shouldn't allow the folks to get to the point where they need hospital beds. We should do what we can to prevent it. But if we're not doing it, what are we going to do? So this data is, I think, is pretty much clear. Cost of schizophrenia, 33% of all mental health beds, 20% of all mental health costs, 25% of all health hospital beds related to schizophrenia, 33% of homeless, maybe 40%, 20% of our social benefit days. Mental disorders are very costly into society. And I just threw in this point, so I don't have on one of the slides, there's some folks, but where to find the money. Well, we can look for grants and stuff, but at our medical school, we're pushing the point that a lot of savings will come from providing services to people who really need them. It won't necessarily need a grant or something to produce it, but if you show that if you're taking people out of jail, if you're reducing the need for beds, then there's a tremendous cost savings to the community. And hopefully the community will respond in kind and making sure other monies will become available. So the indirect cost is strikes in teens and 20s, patients are unable to work. And this is something that we're beginning to appreciate. The mortality rate is 4 times the general population. The lifespan is shortened by a decade or more. And a lot of this is to do with suicide and folks not being able to get it together to get basic medical services. I think Dr. Clark, I love Big After Dr. Clark because he gives them beautiful lead-ins. Where he said the idea is give them some food, good nutrition, sleep, activity. All of these are often things that many of the folks who are not getting treatment simply don't do for a whole host of reasons. So poor mental health affects general wellness, lifespan, most physical conditions, poor outcomes, poor treatment adherence. So and I think the key point I want to make is they're far more likely to be victimized than to be harmed others. Now, I moved to Austin. Austin got a great reputation for health, fastest growing city in the country. So wonderful place. Let's look good on it on paper. Excuse me, folks in Austin who are streaming this too. By the way, it's interesting when I go there. And also it's one of the few blue cities, Texas. You go to Austin, you see a capitol look just like the one we got here, just a different color. And you say, back in D.C., slight difference. That's right. No, we don't see that much. But there's the health of the community is broadening, and there's a lot of parallels with D.C. Like D.C., while health isn't broadening, the health in the people of color is declining, and they're also showing a substantial decline in people of color, what we call gentrification. But parallel with gentrification is not just people or something moving out, but also many of the people of color left behind. There's one tragedy. This is a case of Sophie King, who's a lady who had a long, recurrent history of mental disorders, who was in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and then one day, purportedly, was seen out. She had just been admitted to the hospital, was discharged, was out running around with what was reportedly a butcher knife, according to the police, but it was a small little pocket knife, according to the other people who were there. And the usual story, the police had dropped it, and of course she didn't, and she was shot and killed. And again, the impact on the community was interesting because one, like some of the other cases, everybody knew her, everybody was familiar with her. So it wasn't that she was some strange person coming out knife wielding and killing people. It was a person who had lack of resources, but couldn't get the help that she needed. The community reacted by creating regular conference periods. Actually, the community taxes were increased to support mental health services. And that's not the response of many communities. But again, that is one response. Again, because of a public effort to recognize that this was an unmet need, especially in terms of the relationship to how do the police need to respond to these kinds of tragedies. Unfortunately, we had another tragedy. Unfortunately, a naked young man approached the policeman, got shot. The policeman said that he felt he was at the risk of his life. The question, I think, I don't know if it's good news or not that both of them are African American, but the point was, again, the situation developed where there could have been another approach other than shooting the person that could have addressed it. And what we've seen, again, is that, well, Austin has done a great job in terms of healthcare in general. You notice that the people of color tend to have less access to services. And this is applied around the country. Moreover, what we've always been concerned about is the whole issue about is schizophrenia and psychosis more common in African Americans. And we recognize now a lot of this. There's two things that's going on. One is that there's overdiagnosis because we're not diagnosing depression, bipolar disorder, or PTSD. We're saying that many of these people have psychosis or schizophrenia, and here's an excellent case of it. But also, what we're also doing is there seems to be a parallel between this overdiagnosis and the perception of people with schizophrenia as being dangerous. And I'll come back to that point. But again, what we find in terms of treatment, not only is it is overdiagnosed with schizophrenia, folks less likely to be admitted, more likely to be admitted to hospitals, more likely to be put in the correctional system, more likely to be involuntarily committed, and surprisingly, they leave against medical advice a lot sooner, and they are often not referred for more extensive services. So even though African Americans living in poverty are 3 times more likely to develop psychological distress. Notice I didn't say mental disorders, psychological distress. In fact, only receive 60% less attention to mental health care. And then this is a recent paper that just came out. And most of that, the stereotypes that are used by decision makers are deeply ingrained about this. It shows that disproportionately arrested and disproportionately given longer sentences to Caucasians. So again, the less likely to receive treatment than mentally ill white patients. So more likely to get in jail. When they get in jail, less likely to receive treatments, and also have little inadequate treatment. What is the estimate now? 1 psychiatrist for nearly 1,000 inmates in the correctional system. The chance is slim that they will receive the help they need. Now the other part also is the economics. I mentioned the families. Median income of African Americans is pretty much 60%. It's going up because white folks going up too, but it's been 60%. But as Justice Jackson noted, what we don't consider is family income, family burden. And so most African Americans, 2-3 generations of slavery, we hadn't time to accumulate that wealth. And so our family income is much less. And as a result, if you have a problem like having someone who's severely mentally ill, you often do not have the resources to take care of them. You just don't. So you have to depend on the public sector if at all possible. And so what happens, I've seen many times, I had my patients had to choose between, do I eat today or do I take the medication? And in places, I'll just put a little bit that the places that have expanded Medicaid is a little bit better, thanks to the Affordable Care Act. But those that don't, well. So many individuals with African Americans have poor quality treatment. Culturally related treatments are often lacking. So it's not just simply having treatment. What we find is that the quality of treatment services do matter. And also good old integrated care. And that is that individuals in inpatient settings to outpatient follow-up, that transition for African Americans are much less likely to get follow-up into transition to care. And there's a whole bunch of reasons. Dr. Clark did an excellent job in describing them, but that gap. Now, again, this is American media's perception of schizophrenia. This is a Crow representing John Nash, who I happen to know in the Beautiful Mind. That is their perception is a good white man who's pleasant, easy to get along with, brilliant genius. And just give him the right support and he's going to become just like everybody else. But in the excellent book, Protest Psychosis, what we note is that the role schizophrenia in African Americans that parallel the linking of schizophrenia to African American and overdiagnosis is related to the perception of schizophrenic patients as being dangerous. And Dr. Metzel makes an excellent point that a lot of this perception came because of the race rise, general perception of African Americans as being violent criminals. So what we now have that is a persisting stereotype: schizophrenic patients are often black, schizophrenic patients are often violent. And had a personal experience with that when one of my first research projects. It was a very simple project. I just went out and see how many patients were violent in a state hospital, and found out that black patients were less violent. Nobody believed it. Tried to get it published, and no, it can't be. Study was replicated in 2 other centers, finally got published, but the point was that there was a strong ingrained perception that patients with schizophrenia who also are African American are violent. And also African Americans in the community. Now the other question about causation, going to the whole issue of violence. And a lot of times we talk about whether or not people have schizophrenia, social problems, but also some biological factors as well. This is just one of the factors that, and we can get in controversy about this, but the fact of the matter is the availability of drugs has been associated with the increase in violence, either directly on the brain or because of turf fights. Oops, this one got out of line. I'll come back to that. And just wanted to mention again about drugs. A lot of people use drugs in this country, period, bang. And just wanted to note that these drugs, not only do they affect the brain, but they affect social factors, homelessness, crime, violence, neurotoxicity, and chronic diseases. Clearly, drug use is associated with AIDS, cancer, mental illness. I didn't put up hepatitis C, which has now killed more people than AIDS. Also, in terms of productivity and accidents, just again, reminder that heavy drug use and schizophrenia occur at the same age. In the early 20s, folks getting their first job, trying to get in professional school, and what have you. 50% of people with severe mental illness are affected by substance use. Now, I was just asked a question nowadays, does marijuana treat schizophrenia? I'll just say use with caution. Right, exactly. But what we do find is that, what the data shows that people with the certain gene for schizophrenia are more likely, if they use marijuana early in life, more likely to develop psychosis later. Had some early data showing that opiate use actually helped treat schizophrenia, but it had an important side effect: euphoria and dependence, so it wasn't pursued. But the other thing is substance abuse, less substance abuse in adolescents, and also, so African Americans tend to be less substance use early in life, but the burden is much greater. And I just want to mention James Jackson's medication hypothesis. Very simple. He found that black folks under stress develop unhealthy behavior and to try to deal with it. And one of these unhealthy behaviors, of course, is, can be drug use, overeating, and so forth. So there's a direct relationship between being exposed to stress in a community. So folks are self-treating with drugs, related to drug-related violence, traumatic experiences, increased risk of mental problems. I'll just go quickly through this. People who use lifetime abuse more likely to be victims of drug use. And also, again, that these associated with later onset of mental illness. Dr. Carl Bell, is pushing the idea that a lot of this has to also do with exposure to alcohol in utero. That is that, in fact, a lot of these folks may have unrecognized fetal alcohol spectrum disease, which is associated with impulsivity. And there's been a direct link between lead poisoning. The point is that environmental factors are important and should be considered. And especially as African Americans tend to live in communities with high exposure. And then I was going to be finishing up and noting one of the other findings, and that is 40% of the prison population, 12% of the U.S., 40% of the prison population, black folks. It's been growing 3% in 30 years because of release from hospitals, also because of war on drugs, and there's been an increase in HIV. Disproportionate prison of these folks in the U.S., direct relationship is the number of hospital beds have gone down, the number of people in the correctional system have gone up. And it's associated with lack of access to jobs, homelessness, health benefits, and the barriers towards mental health and substance abuse treatment. Incarceration rates for African Americans especially relevant. But the good news is if you treat people in corrections, they do well. And you reduce a lot of these factors. We have some things called drug courts, which have been shown to reduce crime, cost effective. Mental health courts, diverting right away, rather than incarceration, going right into treatment. But African Americans are less likely to be referred to drug courts or mental health courts. And this is one of the scandals of that situation. And I'm involved with a group that's trying to do something about it. So we've got to improve training and education for law, establish culturally relevant programs, improve access to services. Dr. Clark's already mentioned the legislation that's going through, both in terms of mental health and substance abuse. Hope it gets funded. So we're getting there slowly but surely, but I think the key point is that funding, legislation, and also community awareness so that the community is willing to divert some of its resources to address these problems rather than using them for things that don't work. We've got to get the dialogue, not just how many guns are in people's hands, which is important, but also how many of these folks are going to have resources for treatment and have access to services.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. We've been granted 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to ask you, when you were talking, Dr. Thank you, because I love the statistics, we use them too, because they really are helpful. We talked about the schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
If you look today in the Washington Post, I don't know if you had a chance to read it, there's an article, the African American Museum is opening.
Yes.
And they just pulled the piece of the facade out of the depths of, I forgot the name of the jail. And in the photo, it shows, you see, it's 2 photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one is what? A photograph of how they laid the slaves
Right.
on the ship. If you're not looking, if you're not thinking about it, it's even worse than silver spoons. If you have silver spoons that you grew up in the 50s, your grandpa or somebody had silver set, and all the forks and the knives had to go in a certain way before the thing would close. When you look at this, and I said, whoa, these are people. And the thing about it, if you came over the middle passes, nobody
That's right.
talks about our middle passes. Middle pass 60 million, let's not. But anyway, when you look at that, you see I'm close like this, and I'm taken away from Dr. Stewart, who's my sister, but now she's over there on another ship, and I'm gone. And if you happen to get sick next to me, and we're this close, we're this close. We know about space, and you die. They ain't coming tonight to get you out of there. Can you imagine? My mother, when my great aunt's uncle died, my mom was left at the house and she was 13. Okay, mom was like, oh God, she told me about it. So can you imagine the trauma of being on the slave ship, down in the, we ain't talking about above deck, we're not talking about down below the steerage. We're talking about in the bottom, rocking, first of all, rocking ship, cold water, the Atlantic, and now you're there. And you want to know schizophrenia?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it. The whole middle passage is an important one. The survival rate of the slaves was around 50%. Half of them died before they got to the New World. And they found part of the reason they think was because if they got we needed water, just gave them straight water, made them develop sodium deficiency, and a lot of, and that's why one reason why we think hypertension is so high in our community because those that survived had to have the ability to retain. The other thing is, if you ever get up to Goree Island, I mean, Dr. Newton for taking this up, a lot of those folks killed themselves. I mean, they ran and jumped right in rather than being brought into captivity. And again, the whole issue about involved. So I think that's an excellent point.
Is it, you know, you think
Right, exactly. Yes.
Right here
Yeah.
in the front.
Hi,
You're gonna have to speak up, sweetie.
I will. So thank you. I know that you spoke about accessibility as a barrier to appropriate mental health treatment. And those of us who are in the room who are actual practitioners, I'm sure would like to believe that we are accessible, right? And so do you have any recommendations for those of us who work in the community directly with people to ensure that our services are being conducted in a way that doesn't re-traumatize the people who are accessing us, and to maybe some customer service recommendations for when we work with people in communities that have been traumatized and experience intergenerational trauma. What can we do as practitioners to ensure that when we are providing a service that is accessible in terms of proximity, that it is also accessible and being done in a trauma-informed type of way?
Yeah, I think Dr. Clark did an excellent point already. Stigma. We got to reduce the stigma. Integrated care. You got to work with other practitioners so folks know. What we find is that African Americans disproportionately will go to the primary care physician, go to the buddies, but won't go, if you got mental health on your name, they'll run from you like you got kryptonite from Superman. And become involved with various kinds of community organizations and activities so that folks see that you are, in fact, part of the community. We've been doing a lot of screening tests lately. Some of us use PHQ-9, some of the M3. These are also help the community aware. They also, the whole program, mental health, first aid, go out and get trained in it. And also work with first responders. And work with the police department, with the CIT program, crisis intervention team, another way to begin to help folks become aware, and also let the police department, among others, other groups, know that you can be of value to them as a first responder, because you have skills that are very, very valuable.